Non so più che guardi se è dritto o meno. Se è posato o meno.
Potrei riuscirci a vederlo?
No, ma adesso.
Ah, davvero?
L'ho avviato, però non so se è così o così. No, ma che potrebbe anche. Comunque stare in diretta.
Okay. Hello everyone, I'm Tancredi and I speak on behalf of Rethinking Economics Pisa, and we are very happy to see all of you here for the third meeting of the cycle of seminars, the challenges for 21st century macroeconomics. As you might already know, the topic of this meeting is inequality. In the society, you can see in the society that in the capitalistic system we are living in, the economic conditions of human societies are becoming more and more unequal, in the sense that the rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. When we talk about inequality, we do not only refer to income inequality, but also wealth, well-being, opportunities, capabilities, both within and among countries. Even though in the system we live in, inequalities can be seen basically everywhere, still there is not a unified view in the academia. For instance, the orthodox view was that the problem of inequality should not be tackled from an ex post perspective, but from an ex ante perspective, in the sense that the inequality is the inequality of opportunities. Nonetheless, this approach cannot be accepted anymore, since basically from the 1980s we are experiencing a sharp decline of labor share in to GDP, and a sharp increase of profit share to GDP, and also workers' wages stagnation. Basically, we can say broadly, thanks to the politics of liberalization of movements of capital under Reagan, Thatcher, and so on. Another approach is that the one by the classical, let's say classical and Keynesians, that see that inequality should be seen as the effect of conflicts between social classes, namely capitalists who own the means of production, and workers who just sell the labor force. Clearly, this framework can be extended in order to include also the rising inequality among workers. Just think about the gender gap, or the gap between skilled and unskilled workers, or full-time workers and part-time ones. That is why some economists started to think that the right perspective to look at inequality was the functional distribution approach. That is, by looking at how income is divided between profits, wages, and rents. Among the others, the most famous one is Piketty in his famous book Capital in the 21st Century. Although it must be clear that his analysis is not free from criticisms. The same criticisms that the people is having against toward the economic and social system we're living in. So, few questions might arise. Is the capitalist system itself the cause of inequalities? And if the answer is not, what is the role of the political authority in order to tackle inequality? And specifically, are redistribution policies enough? We'll try to give an answer to this question with two professors I'm very welcome to present. Professor Maurizio Franzini from La Sapienza University in Rome, and Professor James Galbraith from University of Texas at Austin, if I'm correct. I've spoken enough, so just briefly to give you the structure of the seminar. So each lecture will have more or less half an hour, 30 minutes plus, to show us their presentation, and then we would like to use the left part of time to questions by the audience and to discussions, interactive discussion between the audience and professors and among themselves as well. So thank you and enjoy.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It is true that my topic today is economic inequality. It's something I've been working on for 25 years or so, and I've been interested in ever since I was in graduate school. And one of my advisors, and I think I'll leave him in anonymity, said that it was about as interesting as watching the grass grow, and one shouldn't pay any attention to it because absolutely nothing of interest or importance was happening in that particular field. And that put me on guard, I suppose. So I took the opportunity to take up this question, but I have a deeper concern, and that is to use this particular problem to make an argument to you about the way in which economic inquiry might proceed, perhaps should proceed. And this is something which I think all of you who are higher level students of economics probably have had some training on, and perhaps also indoctrination, which is partly associated with the hierarchy of prestige in our profession. At least at the time I was at Yale, back in the late Pleistocene. The top authorities of the profession were the great theorists, the people who put a structure of ideas onto the subject that then flowed down to everyone else. And below them, well below them, were the practical or applied economists. And those who worried about data were even further down, and those who thought about policy really had no intellectual standing whatsoever. And as a result of that hierarchy, a somewhat subversive attitude on my part, I went immediately into the policy realm and only gradually moved up from that bottom tier to the second to the bottom tier, that is concerned with economic statistics. And it's from there, if I have any ideas at all about the nature of the economic issue, in this case the issue of inequality, it develops from a preoccupation with these very low prestige activities, on which I've spent a great deal of my career since I moved from a policy position in the U.S. government to eventually professorship at the University of Texas. And I brought together a group of students who shared some concerns with this. Let's see now if I can make this thing work. There we are. They came from a wide variety, mostly non-economic backgrounds, a physicist, an operations researcher, a political scientist, and from a great many different parts of the world, from China, from Korea, from Portugal, from Mexico, from Brazil. And we formed a research group now a quarter century ago with the idea that we would devote our time to the accumulation and construction of measures from which we might later draw some useful inferences. And this has been the kind of the watchword of the exercise at the University of Texas Inequality Project ever since. And so I use it as an opening. It's a remark made by Charles Sanders Peirce, an American philosopher in the second half of the 19th century, who wrote of Kepler that he undertook to draw a curve through the places of Mars. And his greatest service to science was in impressing on men's minds that the thing to be done that this was the thing to be done if they wished to improve astronomy. That they were not to content themselves with inquiring whether one system of epicycles was better than another, but they were to sit down to the figures and find out what the curve in truth was. Now, with respect to the study of economic inequality, when we got going on this was and continues to be, frankly, a problem in that the profession was working with numbers from which practically anything could be inferred if you had a sufficiently sophisticated econometric technique and were willing to allow your preconceptions to drive your conclusions. And so, just to begin with a comparison, very remarkable work was carried out in the mid-1990s at the World Bank by two economists, Klaus Deininger and Lynn Squire, who brought together all of the then-known, as many of the then-known studies of inequality as they could find, and presented a data set which gave a lot of information on a lot of countries over a lot of years, and it looked like this. It's for just a handful of the countries, and what do you see? If you could make sense of it, you were doing it, you have a better imagination than I have. It's a mess. It's lots of different, in the case of Brazil there, in the first column, third row, you have a lot of data, but it's all over the map. Some years you have 4 or 5 different data points, and in some years you have none at all. For other countries, there are large gaps. You can find a trend, again, good luck making sense out of it. Deininger and Squire, to their credit, did try to reduce their data set to a set of high quality points, and which cleaned out some of the noise, but at the same time cleaned out a lot of the information as well. So you don't have here, even for a relatively advanced country such as Belgium, 4 data points, I should say. And for Barbados, just a couple. It's extremely difficult to make inferences about what's going on in the wider world from an information set that's as sparse as that one, let alone as full of concepts which are quite different for different countries. Sometimes expenditure, sometimes income, sometimes before tax, sometimes after tax, sometimes households, sometimes individuals. Not good enough, in our view, to draw to do the kind of work that we sought to do, which was to seek for consistent measures that might reveal to us whether there were relationships that went across national borders that could be seen consistently in the data. So in order to do something, we had to come up with another way. You can't go back and fill in a survey record, which is what Deininger and Squire and the overwhelming majority of the economics profession were using, if the survey was not taken. People don't have records of their incomes, households don't continue to exist after a period of time, and so this is not a possible thing. You have to find historical records that were taken at the time, and then see if you can, and you add that up across all the groups, you get the between groups component of the t-statistic. The long term assures you that what is a way, sort of a normalization. If a group has an income below the average, it's got a negative value. Above the average, it's positive. You sum the negatives and the positives to get the total statistic. I won't go into that in detail, but it's something which I've often said you could teach to any graduate student in 20 minutes, and it can be implemented on a spreadsheet. It's exceedingly simple mathematical procedure. But we could, for example, go to what were at the time quite exotic data sources. For example, the State Statistical Yearbook of the People's Republic of China, which at that time was not on the web. Somebody had to go to Beijing and buy it, and compute a measure of inequality in China across sectors, which is the yellow line, across provinces, which is the red line, and for the country as a whole, which is the sum of the two. And gets a picture which is very close to the picture that's calculated much more slowly and at much greater expense from survey records. And you can decompose the Chinese case across the provinces, for example, look at what it looks like in 1987 and what it looked like 10 years later in 1997, and you can see very clearly with a little color mapping that what's going on in China is the relative enrichment of the coastal regions, and particularly with the process of economic reforms, while the interior or the Northeast lag behind. Something everybody knows to be the case, but which, as I say, is revealed very graphically and accurately by data in this one. All right. Having started with an exercise that looked at a lot of countries, we became ambitious after a certain point and decided we would tackle the world as a whole. I mean, why not? It's after all, it's a planet that we happen to live on, and so why not see if we could come up with a way of getting comparative data for practically the whole world economy, individual countries, as many as possible for as long a time as possible. And what we did was to find a data set that could be used in exactly the way I've just described. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization produces industrial statistics, which seem to be promising, and with a lot of work we were able to convert it into what is now the largest data set of within country inequality measures, annual, that's available in the world, that doesn't require you to draw imputations across countries or across time. Every year in the data is based upon information for that year and that country. And it's a tile statistic measure, but it can be converted into something much more familiar. And specifically into an estimated measure of income inequality at the household level. Gross income, let's say, after transfers but before taxes. Right? And that we did by a simple regression analysis, running one series as a function of the other for an overlapping subset, in this case about 430 observations, and using basically two critical variables. One of them is our measure of inequality measured across industrial sectors, and the other one is how much manufacturing employment is there in relation to the population, so how industrialized is the country. When you have those two coefficients, which appear in a regression here very precisely with t-statistics in the range of about 8 and over 10, with the ln final is the relationship between our measure of industrial pay inequality and an overlapping set of household income inequality measures. And you control for the characteristics of the income inequality measures, whether it's income or consumption, households or persons before or after tax. And then you just use the two coefficients of the active variables to generate estimated household income inequality measures for as many countries and years as you have that underlying information for. And that's the estimated household income inequality data set, which now has over 4,000 observations for a bit over 150 countries up through 2014. So the question is, does this information tell you anything, either about the relationships between countries or the pattern of evolution over time? And the problem that we face becomes one of presenting the information in a way which is reasonably comprehensible. Maps are a very useful way of doing that, and just using decade averages to simplify things, I can give you a color scheme, which this is for the 1960s, gives you our measures such as we had them at the time for those years, between the, with blue is the low inequality countries, and yellow to orange to red are the higher inequality countries. You see the pattern's very clear. The wealthier countries, which are industrialized, which had strong middle classes, welfare states and so forth, had the low inequality measures. They were especially low in Eastern Europe, which was socialist, and in Northern Europe, which was social democratic. And if you go then down to the developing world, the measures are dramatic. The data set of coverage improves and the picture changes as you move to the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. And what do you see? What you see is a pattern of change in which only a handful of countries today have the inequality pattern that they had in the 1960s. can see it for Finland, you can see it for one or two places in Eastern Europe. That's it. And every place else has moved to a substantially higher level of inequality, and largely to levels of inequality that 50 years ago were characteristic of the third world. Now, it's not to say that these first world countries have become poor. They haven't. They're much richer than they were. But it is to say that the pattern of distribution of incomes today has come to resemble what was characteristic of recently decolonized developing countries 50 years ago. And that pattern is quite evident across the whole planet. But you can also see that all through all this data, a gradient also exists. Countries which are close to each other tend to have similar levels of inequality. No surprise, they have similar social systems and borders that people can cross. And there is a tendency for the northern regions to be less unequal than the southern ones in global terms. But as I say, everything is shifting. That, I think, is to some extent tells you that there is information in the data. It's not just noise. It has some value in some sense in conveying something about the world. But it's still not definitive as to whether the measures are to be trusted and relied upon. So what we did, and this was, I have to say, a daunting amount of work that took a couple of my students, but especially a young woman named Beatrice Howbeck, 3 or 4 years of consistent effort to pull together. It involved essentially going country by country through 30 or more countries, finding every measure of inequality that we could find in the literature, and copying it, and taking a note as to what kind of measure it was, and then color coding it according to one of 3 basic types, whether it was market income inequality, gross income inequality, or net income inequality, and then plotting the whole thing on the chart to compare it to our measure. And our measure in all of these charts is the black line, so you can see it's actually quite long. This is Canada, which is a relatively well-organized, supposedly developed country, and you can see the inequality measures covered an enormous range. If you're familiar with the scale of the Gini coefficient between 1 and 100, the disposable measures in red are relatively low, the market measures are very high. There's a reason for that I want to get to, but maybe I won't trouble you with it right now. And the gross income measures, which are blue, are in the middle, which is all well and good, that makes sense. Our measure is exactly in the middle, basically, and follows the same trend as the others. I'm going to suggest to you that for this case, that's a pretty good sign that you can use our measure for gross income inequality and you won't be wildly off base, which is about, with measures, information sets that are as messy as this one, about as much as you can hope for. And we go through the same exercise. So here are a lot of these things. There's Denmark, another supposedly well-orderly country. And again, our data looks pretty good. It hits the marks of the gross income inequality measures. And there's France, and there's Germany, where in Germany we do very well. We're practically on the mark exactly to the income, to the gross income measures. And there's Greece, so survey data a bit more chaotic. Italy, where again we're doing pretty well, although most of the Italian data turns out to be disposable income and sensibly lies a little bit below ours. There's Japan, there's the Netherlands, there's Spain, there's Sweden, there's the United Kingdom, we're spot on. There's the United States, where we do pretty well until the 1990s, and then we drift below the other measures. And part of the reason for that is that the US data have a lot of capital income, which is not part of our underlying information set, so we can't capture inequalities that are driven by, for example, capital asset prices, the stock market, and so forth. And there's a lot of that in American data, which is not present in the data of other countries, as you've just seen, even other wealthy countries. Whether it's present in their income sets is an interesting question, but the data don't appear to capture it. Well, that's one set of countries, the wealthy ones. Another set, one can call the so-called transition economies, the post-socialist economies. And there, it turns out we do very well as well. There's Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, there's Hungary, there's Poland, there's Russia. It's the chaos of the transition, but in the post-transition phase, even though the measures are very, let's say, erratic, our estimate hangs in there as being reasonably representative of the others. There's the Ukraine, similarly. And then there's a set of countries, the developing countries, where in some cases there's Argentina, there's China, there's India. India is an interesting case because our measure coincides with one data point from a very good survey-based instrument, the Luxembourg study. It's way above the yellow line, which is actually consumption inequality. And that's not surprising. Income and consumption are two different things. Consumption inequality is always much lower than income inequality, but it doesn't mean that India is an egalitarian society or that the consumption number should ever be used to compare India to, say, Denmark, where the two Gini coefficients are similar, but I quite assure you that the two countries are not. And if you think otherwise, I invite you to take a trip to them and just have a look and see what you think. It's not hard to work out that India is a very unequal society. And there are some African countries in the mix, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Kenya, Mauritius. Not bad. There are cases, I want to be fair, where we don't do all that well. And that is typically because in some very large developing countries, our measures, which are based upon manufacturing, undershoot what the survey-based data are indicating. That's true for Brazil, for example. Down there well below the survey-based measures. It's true, for example, in Botswana. It's very interestingly true for South Africa. And I'll just give you a momentary reflection on this. Each time you come up with one of these cases, you want to ask yourself, why is it that our number, which works in so many different cases with just never changing the coefficients, the application, the repetitive application of the same model, falls 30 points below the South African numbers. Well, it doesn't so much for the earlier period, up to late 1980s, that's the apartheid period. Suggestion number one is that a lot of people who were in the surveys in the 1980s were excluded from the surveys in the 1980s because they weren't counted as South African citizens. They were people living in the so-called homelands under the apartheid system, and so they weren't counted. They are counted after the 1990s. But in this period, one of the things that's interesting to find out is that in South African surveys, 30% of households said they have zero income. And that's not to say that they aren't living on anything. There's a basic grant, and then maybe they have occasional income, street peddling and so forth, but they don't count that as income. So in the culture of a survey taker, that comes across as zero. Well, if you have 30% zero, if you think about the way the Gini coefficient is constructed, that's going to add 30 points to your Gini coefficient, even if all the other incomes are equal, which of course is not the case. And so that would explain the 30-point differential between ours, unique to a particular cultural and political context and social history in our country. And I talked about this in Johannesburg, and the people I talked to said, yeah, that's and we worked it out together as a plausible explanation in this particular case. Well, one of the things that's worth bring this to a point where I can almost stay within the time that's was allotted to me, was to ask whether you can extract from this information something about the world economy as a whole. And the way we did that was very simple, to do a two-way fixed effects model in which you have a fixed coefficient for each country. It gives you that country's ranking, roughly speaking, in a hierarchy of world inequalities. And then a time effect, which gives you the common pattern of change in the world economy. To see whether there is such a pattern, and if so, does that pattern tell you anything? Does it suggest anything about what the driving forces are? Well, this is what the time trend looks like, and without further recourse to advanced statistics, I ask you to cast your minds back to the year 1980-81 and ask, there are a few of us here who have smiling the recognition of memory, and ask what happened in world politics and economics in those years. Did anything of significance happen? Were their names Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, for example? And by the way, perhaps even more significant, Paul Volcker, who drove up interest rates in the United States to 20% 20% and more, and precipitated a crisis in the solvency and the debt capacity of much of the world, driving up, as it turns out, inequality in all of the countries of Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia that were dependent upon Western financial institutions, but not in the countries that were not so dependent, specifically not in India, which is still under capital controls and basically long-term development assistance, not in China, which was financially autarkic, not in Iran, which had a revolution in 1979. So, but elsewhere, yes. And it goes on. In the late 1980s, another wave of increasing inequality occurs. What happens? Where is that happening? That's obviously the collapse of the East European socialist governments in the Soviet Union. And then you go on into the 1990s and you get the liberalizations in Asia, including India, including China, and especially the debt crisis that hits in 1997. And then guess what? It stops. And contrary to certain views, including the aforementioned Professor Piketty, it turns out it's not necessarily true that inequalities rise inexorably even in a world capitalist system. In 2000, our trend levels off, at least for a time. It levels off because, among other things, 2000 is a very interesting year, 2001. We have we have the 9/11 attacks, we have a recession, the collapse of the NASDAQ in the United States, the reduction of US interest rates effectively to zero, and then following that, the introduction of the greatly expanded Chinese commodity demand, which produces a period of growth and a period of retreat from neoliberal politics in Latin America and Africa and some other places, but especially in Latin America. And when you get enough countries moving along in the same pattern, guess what? The rise in inequality comes to a halt for a while. Now, inequality doesn't go back down to where it was 30 years, 20 years previously, but the increase stops. You can see that basically you can see a decline in inequalities in the 1970s as well, which I would date largely from the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the stabilizing system, which opened up the world to, first of all, commodities boom, and secondly, a debt boom that came to an end in 1980. So that's the global turning point, the debt crisis. I probably should have added the collapse of the socialist governments and Asian organizations. One final thing. Try and see whether this particular point about the relationship between global finance and inequality can be corroborated with a further data analysis. So another one of my students, this time an Argentine by the name of Maria Delfino Rossi, did some work with exchange rate data and our measures of industrial pay inequality, which are a bit more precise and clearer than and especially insofar as you might expect trade to affect things than the income inequality measures. And here's what she found. A relationship between exchange rates and inequality. Big countries, small countries, rich countries, enormous countries, small countries, India, Ireland, Mexico, Peru, and Romania, and Senegal. This is the exchange rate compared to the US dollar. One place after another. And the more open an economy and the smaller it is and the closer to the United States, the more pronounced that relationship actually is. Now what's going on? It's not some relationship that's driven by trading behavior. It's driven by accounting. It's driven by the fact that every country exports its highest wage products. Right? Mexico exports sulfur and glass and auto parts to the United States and imports lower wage, or produces domestically lower wage products. And when there's a currency crisis, immediately the local currency income, in Mexico's case, the peso income, of the upper income sectors goes up because they're getting the same amount of dollars and it converts into more pesos the next morning. Whereas if you were a taxi driver or a barber or producing tortillas or something for the local market, forget it, your peso income's the same. Inequality is higher the next day. And this shows the data. I think that's the driving factor. And even in countries with like the Netherlands, which are not particularly strong trading partners of the United States, you can see the pattern stronger in some places than others. Italy, okay, Italy is an exception to the period of the Italy is a very idiosyncratic country, and besides, Italy's trade, of course, is with Europe rather than with the United States. Largely. South Africa also is an exception. Although when you find the exceptions, you also find there's a period of fixed exchange rate or some other pattern, which then, if it's broken, the pattern begins to assert itself once again. So it appears that the inequality measures are very closely related on a number of grounds to the artifacts of international finance. You can see this in terms of the timing of rises of inequality. You can see this in terms of the relationship specifically to a financial variable which we know to be driven largely by international speculation and the exchange rates. And you can see this in relationship to the pattern across countries. Bigger countries which are able to defend themselves from international finance, the pattern is much less strong than it is for smaller and more open countries. And the conclusion I would draw is that when you're thinking about inequality within countries, this is a within-country measure, the standard framework of neoclassical economics, which tells you to think about technology and education and labor markets and this and that, tells you approximately nothing that is important or relevant. And why? Because that approach has already driven your attention to microeconomic phenomena, to the functioning of particular things that are called labor markets, whose existence we can even dispute in some material sense, in some conceptually important sense. And it draws your attention away from the common patterns and the relationships which are the essence of a macroeconomics operating at the global scale. And I would argue that that's where our attention should be. This is an integration of Keynesian macroeconomics with the economics of distribution. And when that happens, guess what? The subject becomes unified in a way that it was not before, not on the basis of micro foundations, blah, 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 which turns out to be a kind of conceptual dead end, but on the basis of the power relationships that operate in a globalized economy driven by global finance. And you want to do something about it, that's where you probably ought to look, but that would get me into policy and would get me off of this high-level discussion that we've been engaging, so I'll leave that for the question period. Thank you very much. I was just say that he is Korean, Davis is French, Alexander's Polish, Althea's Argentine. Amin is from Iran, and Jia is from China, so this has really been a global project and something I'm exceedingly happy to be associated with.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here, and I will not talk about the world as a whole. I will be talking about the most important country in the world, which is Italy. Cioè mai fogo sul di me del Barbile, I will make some comparison with other European countries, but that's my main focus. And I want to start from a very simple point that given that we analyze inequality in income, it is important to look at the way in which, the various concepts of income you can use when you analyze inequality, and that's the point that I want to discuss later on, which was the concept of income they were using. So we start from labor market. Of course, in the labor market there are earnings. Those are individual earnings. You can calculate inequality across earnings. Then you can go to the sum of all income coming from the market, and you can end up then in the household, and you can transform this in individual income through the scales of equivalent. Okay? So you have all the income coming from market, not only labor, but also capital or whatever it is. And then you can go to the disposable income, which is income after paying taxes and receiving transfers from the state. The household income changes, and you can calculate again through the equivalent scale, which is the disposable income at the individual level. Why am I making this difference? Because I believe that it's very important in order to understand what's happening to inequality to make a distinction between market income and disposable income. Okay? So that's very important. So you will see that in Italy, what has happened is exactly a different path in market income inequality versus disposable income inequality. Of course, we can discuss which is the most important measure of income. Disposable income is more closely related to well-being, but in order to understand the process, it is important to go to the previous stage, so to say. Now, the starting point is, however, the starting point of my analysis is, however, the functional distribution of income, meaning how much of the total income goes to labor and how much goes to capital, wages, and profits. That would be important also in understanding personal income distribution. And as you probably know, even if it is not so easy to calculate exactly the share of income going to labor and to capital, mainly because the main problem is with self-employment, how much you impute to the income of self-employed. So given that we have this difficulty, in any way, the general tendency in all countries has been in the last 30 years a declining share of wages, with some changes in the last few years, but basically you have that the share of income going to wages go down. The main reason why this happens is obvious: different dynamics in the productivity of labor and in the real wage. Okay, so the real wage has not kept up with increase in productivity, even if in some countries like ours, productivity has not increased that much. Now let us look at some data. This data, the first data I show you, come from OECD. You have several countries, 2, 4, 6, 7 8 European countries plus the United States. This is the Gini of disposable income. You know what the Gini is? You know what is the intuition behind the Gini? If you should explain to your young cousin what the Gini index means, how would you explain that to your young cousin? You could tell him more or less the Gini index represents the share of the income of people earning more than the average that should be taken from them, given to those who are below the average in order to make the income equal, more or less. Okay? So you see that countries with low income, with low Gini index in disposable income are Denmark and also Sweden, Northern, with a tendency to increase. And the interesting question is that increase due to something which changes in the market or something which changes in the welfare state behavior? Okay? We will see that in Sweden, most of the change is due to the welfare state. Italy is the blue one, which is now is the light blue one, the light blue. You see, that's consistent with what James showed before, that we have an increase in the Gini index in the early 90s, and then it seems that it remains more or less constant. That's a big problem, discussion. Why do you say that inequality in Italy has been increasing continuously over the last years? Seems to be not supported by this data. I will come back to this point. So we should not go on saying without making a check that inequality is continuously increasing. But there are problems. And now we go to the marketing. Here you don't have taxes and you don't have transfers from the state. Okay? So this is how income inequality would be if there were no state collecting taxes and paying transfers. Look at Italy. Italy is again the like one. So which huge increase in market inequality has taken place in our country. And you see what happened to other countries. Most of them have had an increase in market inequality. And this tendency is going on also in the latest year. So if I should say which is a common feature of inequality over the last 30 years, increasing market inequality. Okay? Look at Italy, it was the second lowest or the third lowest country in terms of market inequality. Now it is second only to UK. 51% more or less Gini index in market inequality, which is a huge amount. I've seen before South Africa and other countries, they have a Gini index about 50-60%. So if we had no transfers and taxes, we would be in that situation. Of course, if you have that over 20 years, disposable income inequality remains the same, while marketing inequality increases, this means that redistribution measured in this way has been more effective, has countered the push towards side inequality coming from the markets. And we can see that from this measure of redistribution, which is the ratio of inequality of disposable income to inequality in marketing income. These are the data. You see? What happens is that for Italy, which in this case is the red one, redistribution has increased. While for other countries, in particular for Sweden, going down. Independently from market income inequality, disposable income inequality in Sweden increased due to this fact. Okay. So this means that when you want to explain which lies behind inequality, you cannot neglect this. And when you want to find solution to inequality, you cannot overlook that the problem is with the market, so to say, most with the market. Now, what lies behind increasing market inequality? Basically two things. Basically, of course, there are many things, but I want to stress two. If you keep the average composition, the composition of the average income of an Italian family, and you compare that between 1990s and today, you see that there is a huge change that's taken place. The share of income coming from capital and wealth has increased, for the average, of course, while the share of income coming from labor has decreased. The share of income coming from pensions has increased, and this makes for an important point, because if you want to understand which are the implications of this for market income inequality, you can just consider first. Capital income inequality, capital income is much less equally distributed. Okay? So when the weight of this component, which is much less equally distributed, increases, this is a push towards increasing inequality. Moreover, inequality within labor income has increased. So the two phenomena, which I want to stress here, are this one. And the reason why capital income has gained more importance are, at least two. Increasing wealth, which is concentrated, you understand that wealth increases, income coming from wealth increases too. And second, returns to wealth basically have increased over that period. So when you hear about inequality in wealth, you must consider that the Gini index is much higher, simply because you can have a lot of zero with wealth, which cannot have with income, of course. So if you increase the return, this means that some families, some households will get more, those who have wealth, and the others don't get anything more. Now, which is the Gini index, the trend in Gini index in wages? This data come from administrative data sets, and in our group, an interesting work has been done, and it is to match the administrative data with the data from survey. EUSILC is a famous survey for getting information on this. If you take the data from the survey, and if you can connect one way of the with the administrative, you have a lot of information. For instance, we know which is the income of the father, of the parents, of those who in 2018 had that wage in that sector, so we can calculate very much better than usual, which is the influence of these social economic factors on the wage earned. So this comes from this data set, and you see that trend in Gini is increasing from about 30% to 35%. But here we have to make a very important distinction. Annual earnings, weekly wages, and weekly wages of full-time employed the whole year. What does it differ? You see that the Gini index over the annual is higher. Why? Because the number of hours, the number of months, the number of days people work is much more unequally distributed. So even if they have the same wage, the same weekly wage, over the year there will be differences due to the different time they have been working. So one new element is this one, inequality in the time of working during the year. And second, weekly wage of full-time workers shows you that inequality across those workers is lower. So in some sense, we could say these are more homogeneous and stronger in the market. Okay? Those who work all the year have this greater. Now, if we look at different percentiles in the distribution, lowest 10% and then go on, see what happens. You start from that index number in 1990. The index number referred to P10, P25, P50 goes up. The other one goes down. So you have a change in the distribution due to the different dynamics of low wages with respect to high wages. And that's the trend in the mean wage of a private. That's the mean wage. Again, you see a difference between annual, lower, weekly wages for full-time workers. That's the mean. Now, one important point which refers also to the traditional analysis of the reason why we have increasing wage inequality is about the role of so-called human capital. Which is the role of human capital in these dynamics? We find that the role is very limited. Not because, on the average, people with higher human capital, as usually measured, do not, in the average, earn more, but because there is a lot of, within the same group of human capital, endowment human capital, a lot of inequality. This is quite complicated, but see, that's for different level of education, upper secondary, tertiary, and tertiary referred to lower secondary, to upper secondary, and to lower secondary. So there's a ratio between how much each one belonging to that group earns more with respect to the other group. This is the case of the tertiary with respect to lower secondary. You see there's a jump between 1990 and then you stop, and also a little decline. this figure shows you one interesting thing. For instance, take the blue one. The blue one shows the share of tertiary graduates who earn less than the mean wage of the secondary, the upper secondary. So in other words, the share of graduated who earn less than what would have earned if they had the average wage of the lower educated. So you understand that the mean is higher, but there's a lot of people who said, well, if I had been an average upper secondary, I would earn more than what I'm earning as a graduate, which is quite worrying, I would say. And we have similar results for the other data here. If we go into an analysis of the Gini index for groups of equally educated people, you see that the Gini index, the gray one is for tertiary graduated people. The Gini index is very high. 40% of the Gini index, more or less, increasing up to the crisis period and then going a little down. So this means that within the tertiary graduated people, there's a lot of inequality. Can you explain that with traditional theory? Not so much. You don't have much explanation for this. And so we have to look somewhere else. Also, having done this exercise on the decomposition using the tile index education within and between, meaning total inequality can be split in two parts. That part which is due to differences in education, and that part which is due to equal, despite the same education, that are inequality. And of course, the share explained by the between difference in the degree is very, very low and is declining. That's what this graph says. In other words, the main task we have to face, if you want to explain wage inequality, is to explain inequality with the same degree, with the same level of education. Now, when can we look for explaining this? Many possibilities. It is important in the labor market that you are endowed with those which are called soft skills. Okay, soft skills are not human capital. Is that a good explanation for Italy? Not so much. We tried to analyze the importance of soft skills. We found that in other countries they may be more important in explaining differences in wage. For instance, in the United Kingdom seems to be more important, but not in our country. You can have an explanation based upon firm-specific characteristic. Depends on the firm you work on, the type of in contract. But also, what we find as an important element, which is quite general, are personal relations, social relations, networks. Okay? That's a very interesting point. Why do social networks seem to imply a higher earning? If you take a competitive market, you should not pay anything for social network. So, in order to understand, because this happens in the private market with private firms, not only with public employment, as usually Italian raccomandazione usually happens. No, it is something which is more widespread. It's not necessarily so bad, as you can imagine, but it's something which is not human capital. And in order to have this ability rewarded, you need a non-competitive market. A market where you earn rents, and you can employ or use rents for rewarding social relation. Something which needs more analysis. Now, we can go on to the problem of what should policy do. First of all, we must agree that we need policy against inequality. I don't go into all the arguments against, but there are many arguments against, saying, well, no, it's not good for economic growth. No, it is not good because things are going well. All these are very weak arguments. We have no time to go into them, but all these are very, very weak arguments. But one thing that I consider very important is what should be the objective of policy against inequality. Should that be perfect equality in terms of income? I think that should not be. It is something that cannot be accepted for many reasons. And it is very easy to criticize those who say, well, we want all people earning the same. If someone says that, it's better changes his mind. What is to be done with the policy? The objective should be to eliminate those sources of income inequality which cannot be justified according to the best arguments. Okay? And we have a lot of this unacceptable inequality stemming from family advantages, protection in the markets, many other advantages which should not be rewarded with higher income, like tax evasion or things like that. You can imagine how much the inequality could go down if you reduces all these elements for creating inequality quite a lot. And it is difficult also to agree on what is to be an acceptable inequality, but I think it's time to start this discussion more deeply. One element of acceptable inequality is that family background should not count that much. And in Italy it counts a lot. This is a very famous graph showing how much family backgrounds influences income, labor income on part of the children, the offsprings. And the greater is this coefficient beta, which is a kind of elasticity of income in terms of logarithmic father, and offspring, and parents. The lower is the mobility. In other words, the greater the transmission of inequality from one generation to the next. If your father was richer than mine, when beta is high, it is very, very likely that you are richer than me in terms of what you are in the market, independent from any other thing. Italy is the second place after the United Kingdom in terms of this coefficient, and also United States has a very high beta, contrary to the idea of the American dream, which is, of course, it is also important to notice that there is a very strict correlation between inequality as measured by the Gini index, inequality, and the beta index. Meaning, in words, those countries where the rich are much richer than the poor are also the countries where the rich are more likely the son of the rich. Okay? Two different phenomena which come together, and maybe this could be explained by mechanisms like you can have a role for education. The richer the family, the more educated you are, the more educated you are, the more in the average you earn, and so this creates this kind of persistence of inequality across time. But now, to conclude, which kind of policy we can use? Basically, two types of policies: redistribution or what is called predistribution. Redistribution means to use the tax system and the public transfer to reduce inequality in income. Okay? While predistribution is to try to prevent that inequality arises in the market. What I said before creates some good argument in favor of doing more predistribution, so to say. And notice that about redistribution, what we know is this. In the amount of reduction in inequality due to redistribution, the role played by taxes in all countries is low, why it is much more important the role played by transfers. Okay? What is the meaning of this? The meaning is that taxes are not so redistributive. Progressivity of the tax system is, of course, something which has an impact upon its result. And you can imagine easily, if you make the tax system flatter, the red bar will shrink, will become less important. You see, in the United States, the red bar is larger, but basically because the role of the distribution that played by transfers is very low. So even if the tax system is not very redistributive, as a total impact greater, given that transfers are not so important. Okay? So we know that transfers are more important in the redistribution, and we also know another important thing, which is a quite thorny question. Inside, included in the transfers, there are pensions. Okay, pensions. Are pensions through transfers? Not so much. Because the pension you get is not paid by the rich of your generation, it's paid by the worker of your generation. Moreover, the amount of the pensions depends on what you have paid according to the pay-as-you-go system. That's the way in which it works. So we put pensions there because they're not market income, but actually they are not a true transfer. And what comes out is that the role of pensions in all countries in reducing disposable income inequality is very important. In words, pensions go mainly to below average families, also because most of the very rich do not get a pension for earning money from their capital. So this makes for a reduction in disposable income. And if you look at this explains to you which would be the inequality without pensions. Would be much higher, the red bar. Okay? Would be much higher if you had no pension. So one way to put the situation is very simple, is this one. In Italy, markets create a lot of inequality and pensions try to reduce them, which is not a very nice story, not to say. Okay, so if you want to use redistribution again for reducing inequality, you must also keep in mind that in recent years, these are data referred to the last 8 years, from 2016. What happened is this one, try to explain very simply. You have had, if you look at marketing and inequality, you have had sharp increase in those countries, slight increase in those countries, and decrease only in these two countries, where market income inequality was very high. On the other hand, you have sharp increase in disposable income inequality, slight increase, and then understand that's the matching of what happened to disposable income inequality and market income inequality. What comes out is the only country where you have had a sharp increase in market income inequality, but a reduction in disposable income inequality is Finland. In all other countries, there was no decrease in disposable income, and when you have this, must be this situation. Meaning, it is almost impossible to decrease market disposable income inequality without reducing market income inequality. Okay? That's what comes out also from the experience of those countries in this here. So you have to tackle redistribution. And you have to use pre-distribution. And what is pre-distribution, or what is the meaning of distribution? I'm taking here. The reason, one more point, the reason for doing this are also related to economic growth and to the equity, fairness of reducing market income inequality rather than disposable income. I take the example of a gender gap. It's one thing to reduce the gender gap because you pay women more in the market, and another thing to reduce the gender gap because you go to the women and say, that's money from the state for you. Understand? Also, if you have to reduce disposable income inequality between two people with the same level of education. One thing is to say you are paid the same in the market. The other thing is to say he, the lucky one, pays taxes which go to you for giving you the possibility of earning. How do you feel if this one comes to, why should I pay taxes for helping your income? Okay? This means that the mechanism, the market, which makes this decision should be changed. Moreover, some studies show that the relationship, for those who are worried about economic growth, some studies show that given the same level of disposable income inequality, if this comes out from more redistribution, this is less favorable to economic growth than it comes from lower market income distribution. So reducing market income inequality is more helpful also for economic growth. What does redistribution consist in, very generally? In endowments. More balanced endowments, both human capital, physical capital, and you can look at all the aspects which are relevant from this point of view. Okay? Probably I'm not stressed enough that despite what I've said about the fact that education does not explain everything, education is important, of course. And a lot of people coming from lower background is not able to reach the highest level of education. The second point is to change the rules of the game. What is the meaning of this? Many meanings. I give you some example in the next slide. Now think of, for example, antitrust. You know how antitrust has been working over the last years? Allowing a lot of market power to some firms. Behind that market power, there is an unequal distribution of income. Some studies about the so-called superstar firms show that when they become superstar, the share of labor going to labor in their firms goes down, and the pay for the manager goes up. Managers are another big problem. We cannot talk about that. Managers are not capitalists. They become capitalists. But they start as workers, and that's a big problem. And then the other point is that you can use some redistributive policies for changing also market income inequality. In other words, you can have pre-distributive effects of redistributive policies. I'll give you an example. If you tax inheritance, at the moment you tax inheritance, that's a redistribution, okay? But once we have tax inheritance, wealth becomes more equally distributed, and in the long run, income coming from wealth will be more equally distributed. So you have redistributive effect of a redistributive policy. We have also another example, which seems to be true. The share, the income going to the top 1% manager in particular, the gross income going to them, has increased after the tax rate has been reduced. It will be obvious that the net income increases when you reduce the tax rate. It is less obvious that the gross income goes up. Explanation. If you can fight for paying a greater share of gross income for you, you will do that more fiercely if the state does not take much from the extra income you get. See? So it is like comparing the disutility of making the effort for getting more money and the utility of more money, net money you have. So when tax rate go down, you can obtain more also in terms of gross income. That's a redistribution effect of the opposite. If you do the opposite, you reduce the incentive to try to move distribution in your favor. Okay. You see, here are some other possible rules of the game. I cannot go into each of them, but all these are rules of the game, having an effect upon the inequality in market income. Cap on top earnings, difficult, but should be discussed. Minimum wage, all these are new rules of the game. And that's the end. Okay.
I have some observations I'd just like to make.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What was heading?
Thank you. This is very interesting. But there were just a few points on which I think have some importance which I just would like to raise. Let me go back to my presentation. And one of them concerns this notion of market inequality, which I've given some thought to. And perhaps you know the answer to this better than I do. I'll come up to the podium in a second. Okay, let's just take the Danish case or the Canadian case is very clear. These are social democratic countries. And we observe very high measures of market income inequality. Now, there are two possibilities. One is that is a different population. That is to say, the income inequality of people, only of people who work in the market. In which case, those measures were not comparable to the other measures which have to cover all households. I don't think that's the case. I think they are comparable. I think they are the measure of market inequality is a measure that covers the same universe of households. It comes from the same survey. It asks people, what's your market income? Now let me ask you, do any of you here have parents who are retired? Grandparents who are retired? Right? Are they living, any of them living independently in their own household? Right? How many of you are supporting your grandparents? Zero, because you're here. Well, okay, you are. All right. All right, it's a small minority. So what's going on? In a well-developed social democratic welfare state, there are large numbers of households with zero market income. That's what a social welfare state does. It allows old people to retire. They don't have to have capital income for that. They just have to have Social Security income for them. 2/3 of American elderly take Social Security at 62. That's where and this is exactly what I was saying about South Africa, except in a different context. If you have a large number of households with zero market income, then the base of the Lorenz curve is shifted 10, 20 points out, and the Gini coefficient goes up on that account alone. Those households cannot exist in a state which doesn't have a welfare system. And if you see the measures here for the transition economies, you can see that the market measures where you have them aren't different from the other measures. In the developing countries, they aren't different. Why? Because there's no welfare state. So gross income and market income coincide. There is no such thing as non-market income supporting an independent household. So I think we interpret this as something which is a peculiar feature of the great inequality of Denmark. I assure you, I don't think that's a reasonable interpretation. I think it's problematic. The other point I wanted to make was about this question of intergenerational, very interesting, a lot of literature on this. Intergenerational transmission is very low in Denmark. Yeah. Except for the tiny detail that Denmark is a rich country, and guess what it takes to become Danish? It's very useful to have parents who are already Danish. This is called intergenerational transmission of the national wealth. And Denmark is a member of the European Union, as is Sweden, as is Finland, right? And what are they? Enclaves of wealthy people who transfer national wealth to their children, right? We have that in the United States, by the way. We have the equivalent of Denmark. It's called Wisconsin. It's much less unequal than the rest of the United States. It's a small piece of the total. We don't think of it as separate because its statistics are kept as part of the national whole. But if you computed the European statistics, all of you as Europeans rather than by national identity, then those intergenerational numbers for Europe would look much more like the United States than they do. sure, amongst the upper income enclave that is Denmark, the transmission is very low. They circulate amongst themselves. But how many Danes fall to the income level of Bulgaria? Not very many. How many Bulgarians rise to the income level of Denmark? Not very many. So how you draw the category lines in a unified economic area with no barriers to capital or labor movement is going to influence how you get, what answer you get to this question. Right? And one of the things we did, by the way, with this project, which was very interesting, is we were able to compute the differences in income, in pay inequality across sectors for Europe as a whole entity compared to the United States. And the answer was Europe is actually more unequal, because you have to add in those differences in average income between, let's say, Norway and, well, Norway's not in the EU, but let's say Sweden and Bulgaria. And those are bigger than the average differences between New York and Alabama, presently. So the whole picture changes depending upon what category scheme. And this is important. I'll give one last point. It's about policy. There was a lot of discussion about why you would want to reduce inequality. One of the things we find looking at Europe is that those regions which have low inequality have systematically lower unemployment. Now, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is if you are in the south of Italy, where there are no good jobs, you move someplace else, and there are more migrants than there are jobs. And so the people looking for jobs are unemployed until they find one, or until the number of jobs expands. But if you're in Norway, and the difference is very small between a good job and a not so good job, maybe you don't move, maybe you stay put. Maybe you tend your farm, crop, whatever it is. Because the social welfare state says you can do that, and it's not a big sacrifice. Okay? So the more inequality, the more unemployment. The exact opposite of the so-called labor market story, which says we need to have more inequality so that employers can adjust to the skill levels that they're faced with. On the contrary, more egalitarian states have higher levels of employment, and the result of that is that they're able to use their labor forces to provide services, for example, that less egalitarian states don't get because the relevant workers are unemployed. So it's a good reason for arguing for a policy of higher equality is that it's good for employment. It's also good for productivity growth. Why is that? Particularly in smaller countries. This is something the Swedes figured out in the 1940s and 50s, maybe earlier. The Rehn-Meidner model, which is an established piece of the literature, if you know Swedish, and can be read in a few other languages as well. These are economists who work for the Swedish trade union. And what was their argument? Keep the wages compressed, egalitarian, and guess what? You will be inhospitable for low productivity industries which require low wages, and hospitable for higher productivity industries which will employ more engineers and more people with technical skills and so forth. And so Sweden moved from being based on timber to being based on aerospace and engineering and nuclear power and all the things that made automotive, Volvo and Saab, Scania and so forth, and all these things that made Sweden into a modern industrial state over 60, 70 years, and into a very wealthy country. And I would argue that an egalitarian policy is largely, not totally, but largely the driving force behind that improvement. So to say there are reasons that I think hold up very well in the data. There are strong arguments for not for complete equality, but for a disciplined approach to the structure of pay that is available in an economic society. So anyway, those are 3 comments on Professor Franzini's remarks.
A couple of points. About marketing inequality. It is of course true that given that we start from households income, if from one year to another the number of refugees increases, okay, in the same household, someone was working in 1995 and in 2000 was not working any longer, income in that family, in that household goes down. Okay, but of course you can have. So aging in itself is something which makes for a higher market economy quality. But is that the most important of the story for us? Not at all. It is not, because we have many data showing that there is an increasing inequality between wages. I've not shown the data to you, but the number of the so-called working poor, those working and not reaching the threshold of the poverty line, has been increasingly dramatically in the last 2 decades. Okay? According to some data, if you take relative poverty as a threshold, about 25–30% of employed people are poor. On the other hand, we have that a limited, small share of workers, which we define as rich. We define as rich workers those who have more than 5 times the median wage. Okay? That could be acceptable. That share has increased. Still small, but the number, so we have a polarization in the labor market, which explains a large part of the increasing inequality in market income inequality. What about the point on the role of the family background? What we found is that family matters for various reasons, logical steps. There's a lot of inequality not explained by human capital. Human capital is something which is related to family background. So if there is a lot of inequality not explained by human capital, you can say there is a lot of inequality not explained by family, by household. Wrong. Because we find that there is a lot of influence on the background, on that part of the income, on the variation in income, not due to education. It's related to the family background. Through which channels? One I was mentioning before. Social networks, most important. We have a study showing that for Italy, social networks seems to be very important, especially in those markets where there is not much competition. Okay? But also you have the family, which has an importance on the wage, according to more acceptable. You know that beauty is rewarded in the market? 50% is the value of beauty. I don't know what beauty is still. The assumption is those who look beautiful earn more. Is that related to the family background? Not through social or economic factors, but through genetic factors. And if it is true, you have another channel through which the family background influences what you have in the market. Soft skills. Soft skills are you able to talk in public without losing? Where do you learn this more? In the rich or poor families. Okay, how to work in group, team work. It's much easier to have visibility if you work in group. At one point, and I'm stressing with my colleagues, is that universities should care about that. Part of your program should include also exhibition of your soft skills, the good ones, soft skills, okay? How to make a presentation, how to work in group, how to connect and so on. You know, these things that can be worked in the market. So what I'm saying is that in the market, you have a labor market also, you have a lot of inequality, which is not justified by the usual assumptions, and most of them are related to mechanisms which transmit themselves from one generation to another and make for a very acceptable characteristic of this inequality. I don't talk about inequality coming through inheritance, because it's obvious that it's something, okay, it's quite obvious. And you have in that case that the tax inheritance have gone down in our country dramatically over the last 30 years, and I think this is a debate which must start again. what can we do to reverse this trend towards assuming that the lottery of nature is such that if you are lucky enough to be born in a rich family, you enjoy that advantage forever. Why? There's no theory. Remember that when capitalism started and when markets, as intended by economists, were invented, inverted comma, one of the main expectations was not that we will have growth forever, not that GDP will grow year after year, but that in the end, the destiny of the sons will not be determined by where they were born. Okay, it was a kind of meritocratic society against the ancien regime, aristocracy, and if you were lucky enough. So this is an important point which I think deserves more, and is part of the debate on the equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity is part of this. We can say, it's not exactly the same thing, but we can say that if you have a lot of inequality transmitted from one generation to another, what happens? If transmitted from one generation to another, equality of opportunity is attended. It's not. So my idea is that we should start again from this basis to understand more deeply what is going on.
On the floor.
We ask questions by the public.
Yeah.
Questions,
I think people have some.
Like we collect some, if you have any, and...
No. Let's just ask people to ask questions.
Okay.
We don't need to collect questions. I can answer them from the... If anybody has one.
Okay, you're the boss here. So is there any?
Please.
Thank you both. It was very interesting. So I have a question to Professor Franzini about what you were saying. So you were talking about what components that matter to inequality other than human capital. And I was wondering whether you analyzed whether there were differences also by gender in this component. For example, I don't know, for females, family mattered less than for men, or beauty, like I thought this was particularly interesting and it might vary according to gender. It was, just out of my own curiosity.
What we found about the traditional inequality, it is that it is stronger for females. In other words, family matters more when females, girls, rather than young boys are considered. It is understandable. It says that if you have less chances to increase your human capital, as it is the case still with women, it is very likely that family matters more. So if you were born in a poor family and you are a female, the chances that you will be poor are greater than if you are a young boy. That was concerned. About the gender gap, we can say that there is some improvement in general in the labor market. With respect to 30 years ago, the gender gap is smaller, still very high, but smaller. And it is something which I would like to go on into, the role played by some institutions in that. Not the institution which you usually refer to, social norms, the way in which women with children are penalized, but the role of collective bargaining. It seems that collective bargaining, in other words, when the trade unions, women are disregarded in that. They get less. So it is a problem which can be solved by asking trade unions to pay more, not waiting for such changes, but still going there. This seems to explain about 15–20% of the gender gap. And it is something which relates to institutions different from. I don't know whether this is a good answer to your question.
I
can offer a thought here based upon some of this work, particularly what's gone on in the United States. The gender gap, of course, refers to pay. It's what you get for working in a job. Right? But almost all of the information that is collected in the survey record isn't about that. It's about household income. And household income is a combination of the different income earners. Now, if you look at this data, the red bar, most of this information on the surveys of disposable income, household income in the United States, shows almost no change in inequality since the 1990s. How can that be? When we know the inequality in pay has gone up a lot, inequality in capital income, so what's going on in the household sector? The answer is very straightforward. Back in 30, 40 years ago, many of those households had one earner. Now they have two or more. And as a result, the fluctuations and differences are averaged out or reduced by that effect. Now, the income earners in the household are very unequal. One of them is making much more than the other. But the households as a whole, adding a lot more hours, have an income distribution across households, which has actually not changed very much as a result. So it's an interesting, not a completely straightforward phenomenon. You had a question.
Yes, I was wondering, you talked both quite a lot about inequality within countries or maybe within the EU, but what would be your point about reducing inequality globally? I mean, among different countries.
So this gets to, and I'll get to your very momentarily question, this gets to the work of Branko Milanovic, who has looked at the relation, adding in the inequality between countries and the inequality within them. I have a lot of admiration for that work, but most of the information derives from your estimate of the average income of some big countries, specifically China. And comparing the average income of the Chinese to the average income of a European or an American is a non-trivial problem. And you can get lots of numbers of different answers depending upon what you think the consumption basket is and what you're actually measuring. So I'd be very careful. In any event, it's not really an effort that requires you to know very much about what's going on within countries, because the overwhelming movement is the rise of China relative to the rest of the world. 20% of the world population, less extent India and China, 45% of the world's population. So they're active. Again, interesting work, but it's apart from what I do. What I've been trying to do is to look at what you can learn by getting precise measures of inequality changes within countries and seeing how they co-vary across countries and through time. That's been the focus of my effort.
Yes, you were talking about the relation between inequality and exchange rates. I was wondering if in your team we also made some considerations about the adoption of a common currency, as in the case of Europe, and which has been the impact of the absence of exchange rate mechanism, but in terms of inequality across European countries. Because there's also this.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, and you're right. What we've done is basically only looked at the national exchange rate, so the data for Italy and when Italy gives up the lira and so on and so forth. And when you get, as a broad rule, when you get to be a bigger currency unit, then the importance of the currency relative to some other currency is going to decline. Because you're more of a closed system. Europe as a whole is much more closed than France or Italy are individually, because they trade a great deal internally. And so the currency effect is going to be much less inside of Europe. That is just, however, the offset of that, or the problem, is that without the ability to adjust your currency, then you're stuck with internal devaluation in response to the pressures for austerity policies. And I don't need to, I think, tell anybody in Italy or Greece or Portugal or Spain or Ireland about that. And I worked with the Greek government in 2015, so I had a rather acute exposure to the consequences of an internal valuation policy. It is much easier to devalue because that gives you an adjustment that affects everybody from the outside. You have to devalue internally, then you have to break every trade union agreement, every wage structure that exists in order to get people to accept the lower wages. And by and large, it destroys them. It is socially incredibly destructive to the follow that route.
Yeah, and I also had a question for Professor Franzini. If I
Okay.
can. You had the graph about the tertiary education, let's say, the wage lower than the secondary education was very depressing, but also very interesting. I was wondering if you think that recent labor policies from 90s in terms of flexibility and the introduction of non-standard employment may also help to explain this problem, in the sense that many qualified workers were trapped in non-continuous occupation, non-standard employment with the lower wages. And about the relation between wage increase and productivity growth. Which role do you think, because it was in the slide, which role do you think collective bargaining at national level can have in trying to link the two things more, of course, with the policies in terms of investment, if there is a margin in this sense in Italian economy?
Okay, how many hours do we have? Okay, I will say one thing about between and you asked a question about between and within countries inequality. I want to give you an example about European Union, EU 28 countries. If you take the European Union as a whole, the inequality within the 20 countries as a whole is not so low, it's very high. Okay? But during the last 10 years, things have changed a little because of two conflicting phenomena. Inside within most countries, inequality has not decreased, or in some cases has increased, but between inequality, due to the fact that the average income of the lowest income countries has increased, this has reduced. Instead, so this is also interesting from a political point of view. If you want to reduce inequality in Europe as a whole, you should increase the income of the lowest country, and you have to give them a chance, which some people see as an advantage which they do not deserve. So it's a political problem. What about the question on capital income and why upper? There's also a problem of demand for human capital. We are a country where, if you look at the data on where did the increase in employment which took place over the last few months, years, recovery, have been created, can you answer this question? The hugest number? What? Low skill in general, but which in specific sectors?
Tourism.
Okay, waiter, hotels, and B&B, and things like that. Do you think that a PhD student has any chance of employing his abilities in this kind of jobs? Okay? There's a nice analysis by ISTAT, the Italian National Institute, on if you ask people with a high human capital, how much of your competencies are used in the work you are doing here? More than 30% say, but for a very limited amount. So this means they accept jobs which are not up to their competencies. Okay? Why they do that? Of course, you can imagine different things, but the main answer is because there is now better jobs for them. If you look at what happens to those who get a PhD and they go out of our country, okay? There is a nice, again, survey done by the National Institute, Statistical Institute. Those who are those who graduated between 2010, 2014, some years ago, about 30% are not employed outside Italy. They earn about 1,000 euro more per month. But if they ask, would you come back for the same pay in Italy? They say no, because there is no job for me. Okay, so we have a big problem which is at the intersection of education policy, industrial policy, innovation policy. You cannot understand what happened in the labor market without looking at this. And so when you think that you can solve the problems of employment through mechanisms like reddito di cittadinanza and joking, you are joking. Okay, let's say something which is not serious, because the problem is completely another one. Which was the other question?
About the collective bargaining and investment.
Oh yeah, bargaining is very important, and you know that there are two levels of bargaining: collective and collective bargaining has weakened over the last decades for several reasons. We have a very nice result that shows that for each decision increasing the liberalization of capital over the last 3 decades, this has resulted in a weakening of collective bargaining. And that's easy to understand, because liberalization means a stronger bargaining power on the side of capital, and it reduces the power of. But we also have results showing that those firms which are still limited number in Italy, which may recourse to lower level bargaining, not collective but at the firm level, this is in some sense it is good. I mean, it makes for a better situation for the workers. And also productivity seems to increase. In other words, more cooperative. Having this bargaining means that the climate is more cooperative, and when it is more cooperative, we have advantage both in terms of productivity and on wages. But you need the culture on the parts of the entrepreneur. And as you know, the average education of the third entrepreneur is very, very low. So it is very difficult that the one coming from the upper secondary school at the maximum will offer a job to a PhD student who does not understand exactly what he can be able to do for his own firm. So this is
actually, my question has been encompassed by Armando.
Oh, sorry.
Because I found a bit odd that no one up to now had talked about employment directly. I mean, because in particular in Italy.
Could you speak out a little bit, because
Yeah,
I'm having trouble hearing you.
in particular in Italy, I think this couldn't be stressed enough. I mean, we have low participation to the workforce, high unemployment, low real wages, and so on. And the public debate is all biased towards redistribution policies. So unemployment subsidies, pension, and so on. I mean, for our particular case, I don't know about the world, but it is important to focus on what is the king pre-distribution policy, so to speak. That is, of course, to pursue, to get close to full employment and to keep an eye on industrial relations. Comment on that, please.
The extent that I understood the question was what were the key policies to reduce inequality, and I would first of all note that when you're looking at the large population of any country, particularly any advanced country, the share in manufacturing is pretty small. So one is really looking at the conditions for people who are working in services. That's what most people do. And what is of concern is, first of all, the basic level of the wage. Secondly, the security of retirement, capacity to own and or maintain a home, the access to health care, the quality and cost of education. And when you put all these things together, you can tolerate a fair amount of inequality in household income, because the basic problems of life don't depend on it. And so you have to, I think the important point is you have to take it all together. But for people who are overwhelmingly working in the services sector in an advanced economy, it's the larger social conditions that matter. And unfortunately, it's those things which have been under attack. They were built up in the 20th century, they've been torn down since the 1980s in much of the advanced world. They have really been under assault. Why? Because we have, it's a political effect of the increasing concentration of income. Very rich people don't want to be taxed to pay for those services, which they themselves do not need. And the extent to which power accrues to very rich people, then you end up with a hostility toward the service. We see this in SMEs. People say U.S. doesn't have a social welfare system. It's false. We do. We we have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have unemployment insurance, we have food stamps, all of these things. Plus we have public education, plus we have a lot of public universities. We spend as much on public universities as Europe spends on all universities. Right? And all of these things are under attack, except for those that are enclaves of the very wealthy. That's still a big problem.
Thank you.
Can I answer?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. First of all, employment was mentioned here, and there's no time to look through that. But I want just to draw your attention to this point. Take Italy again, not only Italy. Beginning of the century, increasing employment, large number of increasing employment was very huge. Inequality did not change. How do you explain that? Because inequality should change when you reduce unemployment if people earning zero starts earning a positive amount and the others do not change what they earn. What happened in that period is those employed, low earning, their income went down further. So the effect upon inequality of this was very low. You understand? So there are many other forces making for higher inequality that you cannot counter simply by increasing the number of employment. Depends on the policy you make, which must be very, very specific and very, should consider all these other aspects.
Yes, it's a question regarding both of you. Research projects. I would like to know if there are any convergencies with complexity theory that is quite in vogue today, especially so in the case of what is the correlation between productive sophistication and income inequality, and if such, as I think there is, if such correlation exists, what are the prospects for countries that are going through deindustrializing processes right now, especially so in countries that haven't even become industrialized and are deindustrializing?
Sure. Some of the sort of mathematical framework that you're describing is actually part of the underpinning of the work I described, because fundamentally we're looking at a piece of the distribution and making inferences about the whole thing, and that depends upon a property called self-similarity, which is a fair description of the world. It is the case that I can't even see the sky, but I can glance out that window and give you a good guess about what the weather is like. Just from a sliver that I can see. I can tell you it's cloudy, right? And that it's a little gray out there today. And I bet if I went out and looked at the whole sky, that would be, looking at an income distribution is approximately similar kind of exercise. So this whole business of fractal dimensions and so forth is a very useful thing to have there in mind. What we find, though, is that there is structure there. And if you look at where the active elements in an income distribution are, you find that driving at the top, finance, and separating the middle from everything else, manufacturing. Because everybody who works in agriculture and services, aside from the high-end finance types, they're all retail, wholesale trade. These are low-paying jobs. All the barbers, all the taxi drivers, there aren't any wealthy people in that category, and there aren't any small farmers and peasants are not wealthy in developing societies either. So that's, those are actually very egalitarian. So one consequence of deindustrialization is it actually makes the society more equal, but not in a useful way. Again, part of the advantage of having the manufacturing and having that strong middle class is that you have a constituency for universal services, and that raises the standards for everybody. And that's part of it. Thinking about this in a kind of holistic way is very useful. How does it play to the kind of this notion of intrinsic complexity? I guess my view is it plays, a sensible way to think about it is that the more diverse and complex your economy, the more stable it's likely to be. Countries which are dependent upon a single crop or a single mineral product, copper, cocoa, they're dependent like oil, although oil countries tend to be rich. They're very, very vulnerable to fluctuations in that price. But a country like Korea, which has diversified its manufacturing base and produces a wide spectrum of products, is able to kind of be insured against that kind of volatility. And that is why you don't want to develop according to the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage. It's a complete nonsense. It's the diversified economies that are strong and the specialized ones that are weak and they're vulnerable to crises. I mean, Ricardo, I don't know what his merits were in his own day, but fundamentally, even as early as the mid-19th century, the United States totally diverged from this Ricardian view, developed behind a protectionist wall a diversified industrial base, which is why the North won the Civil War, and why the United States won the First and the Second World Wars. And guess what's happening now? Well, we're letting China do that, so good luck to them. They're doing exactly, in fact, what we did a century earlier.
I think that one, just to be short, you have to look at the way in which each sector evolves. Technology, artificial intelligence. All these things are very important and independent from the sector. You know, if we talk about gig workers, do you know how many gig workers are in the world now, today? An increasing number of people doing that job. There's service, partly manufacturing, so it is difficult to say which is the sector which they belong to. So what I'm saying, just to put a label, is that the direction and the use of innovation is crucial for everything, both which sector you are. And you must know that there's a big, huge problem with this. We have not been talking about the effect of digital technologies on inequality, but they have an enormous impact. Just a few words. Usually, when you talk about this problem, you talk about human capital. Okay? The conventional wisdom is a matter of having the competencies. If you have the competencies, you are all right for forward. They never, the emphasis on the huge effect of these technology platforms in particular on the creation of rents, on people not working at all. Listen, man, that's incredible. See? How do you call the income accruing to those who manage a platform? Rent. They don't put work, they don't put capital, marginal costs at zero, the incredible amount of. Is that relevant for what happened? Absolutely. Is that linked to other institutions? Think of the way in which Bezos and his CEO have become rich as they are in a very short period of time. In the past, to accumulate that wealth, you needed about 2 generations. Now, in 10 years, you can accumulate that amount of money. Thanks to what? Monopoly capital, stock market working in a very strange way, odd way. You know that Amazon was not distributing €1 of dividends for years, and the price in the stock market rocketed, exactly the opposite of what every dealer would say to you. You need an expectation of dividend in order for. That's the opposite. Where does the pay of the manager come from? Going up of the value of the money. So what I'm telling you is there's a lot of unacceptable inequality in this technology, coupled with tolerance in market, the way in which the stock market works, the way in which managers are compensated, the compensation, the incentives there. And so this goes across the various sectors. And I think that this is something which needs much, because notice, I stress once again, the point of inequality with platform is the worker with human capital earns more than the worker with less capital. And all the other story, hidden no one talks about it.
Let's say a word about this question of rapidly accumulated wealth, Jeff Bezos and Amazon. This is not monopoly power. What it is it's the Schumpeterian phenomenon, so-called creative destruction. But specifically, it's the market capitalization of a company that is heavily owned by its original founder in this case, and that was true of Microsoft and true of Oracle and true of Google, or ABC, the parent company. And so the question is, how do you deal with it? You can't stop it and still have a capitalist system, because new companies get founded and the market takes a shine to them. They have a successful public offering, and guess what? A billionaire or a multi-billionaire is free. What you can do is prevent the passage to the next generation. And that's the function of a good estate tax. A good, well-functioning estate tax, and the US one has become much weaker, but it used to function much better, says, okay, when you die, your assets are frozen, appraised, and the government can come and take 70% of them or 60% of them above a certain threshold. And in the case of someone like Bezos, that would be a very small fraction of his total wealth, the threshold. So what do you do in that case? Well, you enjoy the wealth for a period of time, and then you create a foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Or if you're somewhat less, you give it to a university, or to a fund, or to a hospital, or to your church. You make sure it's out of your hands and into the hands of some non-taxable entity before you die. And guess what? I mean, go visit American universities. You will discover that their buildings are covered, not with the names of great scientists and artists and so forth, but with the names of the big donors. What are the big donors doing? Well, primarily they're escaping taxation. It's called estate tax socialism. And it's a very successful way of ensuring or helping to ensure that you don't get these dynasties. Now, as I say, we're deep in dynasty land now, so it's not as effective as it used to be. But that's just because the dynastic forces have been against it. This is the way you deal with this problem. And of course, if it's big artworks, they end up in museums. This is why we have the National Gallery, for example. So anyway, that's my view on that. Let them play with it for 10 or 20 years, and then make sure they give it away. I don't know, we have Katerina and then a couple of the back.
I had a question on the role of artificial intelligence in reducing inequality. And you partially replied to it, but on a side we see that data can be considered as a new factor of production. I think about Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and the institutions are not able to properly tax this new factor of production. And on the other side, what?
They are free.
Exactly. So, and on the other side, we can think about big data as a huge help in improving welfare performance. For example, I can think about how we could use big data to get more accurate and direct estimates of citizens' economic situation in order to reduce tax evasion and tax elusion. But for sure, the reply is not univocal. And on the other side, can we talk about systematic delay of the politics towards data and the evolution of technological change?
Okay, many problems. First of all, data are an input which is free, not paid for. Okay? It is an input which is worth a lot for all what you know. Selling, as one said, our own tastes, what we are, our preferences, they are sold. Another book by Zuboff called The Surveillance Age, meaning that data kind of surveillance, and they sell what they know about us in order to allow other people to make money. Okay? So I say that data must be paid. If you don't make data paid, you cannot solve the problem. Is it possible, someone says it is. Technology can help doing that. Blockchain can help with a market for data. In other words, if you want to sell the data about you in the morning, you make a kind of contract that morning with one who buys, establishing everything you can use, you can pay, and this would make for a much more equal society than we have now. What about the use of big data for the purposes you were saying? Yes, of course, they can be very important. The public administration will need more data scientists. There are not many data scientists working in the public administration. But please notice there's a big problem. Privacy. You know, there's no privacy at all with the data taken by Amazon and Google. There's a lot of privacy with the data used for making research, for controlling tax evasion. You know, there have been cases in Italy where the privacy authority said, no, you can give this data to the body who can make control on tax evasion, because you are, as a financial piracy. So we have this institutional problem, which has to be solved before going on, and it's a very, simple but extremely consequential file on the problem of piracy with One thing about taxing wealth, that's important, James, but I would say that the wealth once accumulated has been income not given to others. Okay? And if it is income not given to others, those others in some way are lost. And you cannot recover that once you tax inheritance. You see what I'm saying? If you accumulate money, sharing, because you take a greater share of the income and they get less. When you transfer to, okay, but
I want to talk a little bit about wealth tax. A very fashionable idea in the U.S. is that we should have an annual tax on wealth. Elizabeth Warren has come out with it. Bernie Sanders followed her. It's the product of the influence of Messrs. Saiz and Zuckman, the influence of Mr. Piketty, and it's just a piece of mischief in my view. It's just simply will never require you to have a register of the market value of personal wealth, which is a fantasy. Forget it. Which people pay their own appraisers. You would have an amazing amount of, would be very good work for appraisers who would then report the value of the paintings and the real estate and so forth in such a waste of benefit tax. The whole business is just not a realistic way. We have income tax, we have property tax, we could have a land tax, we could have we have an estate tax. These things are tested and they function. One of the big differences in taxation between the US and Europe is that Americans report their incomes. The tax on them is quite elastic and relatively low for rich people. But we don't have Switzerland, we don't have Luxembourg, we don't have the Jersey and Guernsey. And until Europe deals with that problem, you're going to still believe, for example, that the Italian 1% is less wealthy than the Russian 1%. Forget it. Or that Italy is more egalitarian now than it was in the 1960s. I don't think so. Or France. Go to Paris and have a look at the real estate values and try to persuade yourself. I was there in the 1960s. It was not less egalitarian then than it is now. It's absurd. What's happened, of course, is the tax authorities don't track and collect the incomes on the incomes of the wealthy, the very wealthy, for the obvious reasons. In the U.S., however, it's a little different. We do get those incomes, we just don't tax them. So everybody diligently reports their incomes and pays the tax that's required, which is relatively low. It's a different, at least gets you better data, that's all I can say. Now, one other thing on artificial intelligence, I know we're coming to an end, so I have to conclude with a little story that I once heard from my father, who was responsible for the control of prices in the Second World War. So he was more powerful than Stalin, practically, and certainly almost as disliked as Mussolini in the United States. But he said many years later that he realized dealing with the people from the various economic sectors that after a while they began to resemble the products that they produced. And if you were working with the people who dug anthracite coal in West Virginia or produced steel I-beams for construction, this was very clear. Those people had the same characteristics of the products, mental characteristics of the products they were producing. And you know, on the other hand, the oil men were rather smooth. And he said, and in the international business machines of that era, you could almost begin to discern the elements of artificial intelligence.
Unfortunately, we don't have any spare time because we're so we got to leave. So thank you everyone for coming here. We invite you to the fourth meeting of the seminar. Today is the 13th of October, and we will invite Dr. Yannis Tafernos from SOAS University and Dr. David Adler of DM25 to talk about the Green New Deal. So thanks for being here, and bye.
Thank you again.